It's a sight that villagers see every morning, a dog, with a dull coat and an emaciated body, always showing up in the same corner of the cemetery on time, huddled next to the tombstone with its name inscribed on it. Its figure blends in with the silent cemetery around it, as if it should have belonged. No one knows where it came from, and no one knows who exactly it is waiting for. The cemetery is located on the edge of the village and is surrounded by sparse woods. Every morning, the mist fills the air, the dew hangs on the blades of grass, and the air is cold and moist. In this environment, the dog stands out. It lay quietly in front of the tombstone, its ears slightly drooping, its eyes empty but intently staring ahead, as if expecting something. Occasionally, it would raise its head and let out a low whimper that sounded like a call and a lament. Villager Michael Lee, who passes by the cemetery every morning to work in the fields, was one of the first to notice the dog. At first I thought it was lost, says Michael Lee, but after a few days, I found that it was in the same place every day, rain or shine. At one point, Michael Lee tried to get close to it to see if it needed help, but the dog didn't seem interested in anyone and just stayed there quietly. The weather at the cemetery is unpredictable, sometimes with early morning mist, sometimes with midday sun, sometimes with violent storms. And no matter what the weather, the figure of this dog is never absent. The villagers began to notice its persistence, and everyone's minds were filled with questions. Why did it stand in front of that tombstone? Who is it waiting for? Or is it guarding something? One day, the rainstorm poured and the whole cemetery was muddy, but the dog was still lying there, soaking wet, and his hair clinging to his emaciated body. The rain ran down its face, but it remained motionless, as if the tombstone were its whole world. The villagers in the distance couldn't help but redden their eyes when they saw this scene. Who the hell is it waiting for? A young village woman whispered. Over time, the story of the dog spread throughout the village. Some people say that the dog may have been abandoned by its owner, and came to the cemetery by mistake, and took the tombstone as the owner's home. There is also speculation that its owner may be buried under that tomb, and it is guarding the master's final destination. The children in the village were so curious about it that they sneaked to the cemetery several times to feed it, but the dog refused to go too far from the tombstone. It carefully takes the food, then quickly returns to its place, continuing to lie down beside the tombstone, head bowed and thoughtful. It must have a story, lamented an elderly woman in the village, and only it knows the answer to such loyalty. Despite all the talk among the villagers, no one has been able to unravel the dog's secret. It behaved too persistently, too lonely, as if its whole world revolved around that tombstone. Someone tried to look up the name on the tombstone, trying to find clues from it, but it was an ordinary tombstone with an unfamiliar name engraved on it, without any additional information. Time passed, and the figure of the dog was still the same. It guarded silently, as if waiting for a reunion that would never come. And its persistence has also made more and more villagers begin to pay attention to its story. The minds of people are full of questions. Who exactly is it waiting for? Is its owner really buried here? Or is it just lost and refuses to give up? This is a dog full of secrets, a dog that interprets love with persistence and loneliness. Its story has just begun, and its waiting makes people can't help but want to explore the truth. Although the villagers were deeply shocked by the dog's loyalty, the story between it and its owner under the tombstone remains a mystery. It wasn't until one day that a young man from the city, named Emily, happened to pass by the cemetery and heard the story of the dog, which revealed the deep affection between him and his owner. The dog's name is Max, and its owner is my Uncle John. Emily gently stroked Max's head, a hint of choked in her voice. Emily begins to tell the villagers the story of John and Max. John is a military veteran who has experienced too many lives and deaths on the battlefield. After retiring from the army, he moved to this small village in the middle of nowhere, where he lived a simple and lonely life. The villagers knew that he was a quiet man who didn't usually interact with people, but his kindness and gentleness were impressive. One winter 5 years ago, John found Max in the woods outside the village. At the time, Max was a skinny stray dog, shivering from the cold, curled up next to a fallen tree trunk. When John saw it, the heart in his heart, which had been sharpened by the battlefield, felt the warmth that he had not felt for a long time for the first time. He carried Max home, wrapped it in a worn-out blanket, and fed it hot milk. Emily recalls, from that day on, Max became his family. John and Max's days were simple but full of warmth. Every morning, John would take Max for a walk in the fields outside the village. Max always ran ahead excitedly, looking back at John from time to time, while John followed behind with a smile. Whenever John sat in the yard repairing his old wooden chair, Max would always lie quietly at his feet, watching him with those deep eyes. Max was more than just a dog to John, it was more like his family and even the salvation of his life. Emily said, "John once told me that Max had helped him rediscover the meaning of life." However, fate did not give the pair of loyal partners much time. 2 years ago, John was diagnosed with advanced lung cancer. Although he tried to hide his condition, his body was getting weaker and weaker day by day. Max seemed to sense something, and it became more clingy than ever, almost keeping an inch of his side by John's side. In John's last days, Max always lay on his bedside and licked his hand gently. Emily's voice lowered, it knew it was about to lose him. On the day of John's death, Max stayed by his bedside until the ambulance took his body. Later, John was buried in the cemetery outside the village, and Max began his long waiting from that day on. "Why is Max here?" Villager Jack couldn't help but ask. Emily sighed, because John once said to it that no matter what happens, he will always be with it. The relationship between them was so deep that Max must have thought that as long as it stayed here, John would come back. When the villagers heard this, their eyes turned red. They never imagined that this dog's loyalty would come from such deep affection. Emily continued, "After John's death, I tried to bring Max home, but it wouldn't leave the cemetery. It broke free of its rope and ran back here. Since then, it has stood guard in front of the tombstone every day, rain or shine, and has never left." The villagers fell silent. They finally understand that Max was waiting not because he was lost, but because of the promise he made with John. Its loyalty was a reward for John's lifelong companionship. From that day on, the villagers cared more about Max. Not only do they bring food and water to it, but they also take turns taking care of it spontaneously. Someone built a sturdier shed for it, and someone even proposed to build a monument to it in honor of its loyalty. "It's not just John's dog, it's the pride of our village," Jack said. After Max's story spread in the village, more and more people began to pay attention to its actions. Its loyalty not only touched the villagers, but also made everyone who heard its story rethink the meaning of love and companionship. And Max still stands in front of the tombstone every day, using his life to fulfill his promise to his master. There was sadness and hope in its eyes, as if it believed that as long as it kept watching, John would come back, take its rope again, and take it for a walk in the fields. In the early morning, the mist of the cemetery gradually lifted, and the sun shone on the tombstone through the sparse branches, and the dog still lay there like a statue. Its body was emaciated, its hair was disheveled, and it was even bald in some places, but its posture remained the same, its front paws were pressed against the ground, its head was slightly lowered, and its eyes were staring motionless at the tombstone. Occasionally, it emits a low whimper, a voice full of sadness that seems to tell a story that no one knows. The villagers found that the dog would show up at the cemetery on time every day, and whether it was the early morning dew or the cold wind at night, it was never absent. It has been noted that it barely eats or drinks, and occasionally receives food from well-wishers, and it only symbolically licks a few bites before returning to the tombstone to continue its waiting. One day, the sun was so hot that the whole cemetery felt like it was being roasted by fire. There was a wave of heat in the air, and the dirt on the ground was dried and cracked. The villagers took refuge in their homes to escape the heat, while the dog remained motionless in front of the tombstone. Its tongue was slightly outstretched, gasping for breath, obviously too hot, but its eyes were still steadfast. Villager Michael Lee couldn't stand it anymore and walked over with a bucket of cold water. "Silly dog, why are you still here on such a hot day?" Michael Lee crouched down, poured water into a broken bowl, and pushed it in front of the dog. The dog raised his head and glanced at him, with a hint of mixed emotions in his eyes, as if thanking him for his kindness, but instead of drinking water immediately, he glanced at the tombstone before slowly lowering his head and licking it. "It's not an ordinary dog, it has its own obsessions." Michael Lee sighed, shook his head and left. A few days later, a sudden rainstorm swept through the village. The cemetery became a muddy swamp, and the rain ran down the tombstones, washing the dirt on the ground into chaos. The villagers thought the dog would never be seen again, but when the rain stopped, they found him still lying on his stomach next to the tombstone, soaking wet, his hair clinging to his emaciated body, but his eyes still did not leave the tombstone. "What the hell is it waiting for?" Villager Xiao Zhang stood in the distance and couldn't help but redden. He tried to get close to the dog and take it home to shelter from the rain, but the dog stubbornly broke free of his hand, ran back to the tombstone, and continued to lie down as if that place was where it belonged. The rain made its body weaker, but its will did not waver in the slightest. The old people in the village began to discuss, this kind of loyalty is not even possible for a human being. Over time, the story of the dog spread in the village. More and more people are paying attention to its behavior. Some people bring it food every day, some people bring clean water, and some people build a small shed for it to shelter it from the wind and rain. However, it seems to be indifferent to all of these helps, and it accepts almost nothing except the necessary food and water. Once, an out-of-town tourist heard the story of the dog, thought it was pitiful, and wanted to take it home for adoption. He took the dog food and toys and tried to attract the dog's attention, but the dog just gave him a cold look, then turned around and continued to lie down next to the tombstone. The tourist shook his head helplessly and left. "It's not that it has nowhere to go, it's just unwilling to leave." The villagers lamented. The dog's behavior not only touched the villagers, but also caused them to think deeply. Some say that its loyalty reminds them of the affection and friendship they once neglected, some say that its waiting makes them understand the true meaning of love, others say that its story made them re-examine the relationship between humans and animals. It tells us with action what true love is. Uncle Zhang from the village said, "This kind of love doesn't need words, and it doesn't need to be reciprocated, it's just a pure companionship. Whether it's cold winter or scorching heat, whether it's sunny or rainy, this dog always stands guard in front of the tombstone. Its body is getting thinner and thinner, and its hair is becoming thinner, but its eyes are still full of persistence and expectation. The villagers try to unlock its secrets, but its persistence makes people even more awe-inspired. Its act of loyalty touched the entire village and made people rethink the meaning of life. Perhaps, its story is not just about a dog, it is also about love, companionship, and the belief in never giving up. The dog's waiting, like a silent poem, is written next to the tombstone and in everyone's heart. Its story is not over, and its loyalty has been deeply engraved in everyone's memory. As the days passed, Max's body became weaker and weaker. Its fur has completely lost its luster and its steps have become faltering. But it still appeared in front of John's tombstone on time every day, lying on the ground, staring at the tombstone with those deep eyes, as if waiting for a figure that would never come again. The villagers are accustomed to Max's behavior, but they also feel great sorry for the loyal dog. Some tried to persuade it to leave, others tried to take it home, but Max always stubbornly returned to the tombstone, telling everyone with his persistence that its heart was connected to the owner under the tombstone. One day, the villagers discover that Max did not show up at the tombstone as usual. They searched everywhere, and finally found it lying peacefully in the small shed next to the tombstone, as if asleep. Its body was already cold, but there was a smile on the corner of its mouth, as if it had finally waited for the person it had been waiting for. Max's departure plunges the entire village into deep grief. The villagers gave it a simple but heartwarming funeral, and they buried it next to John's tombstone, so that it could be with its owner forever. The land next to the tombstone has since become the most special place in the village. It's finally reunited with John. Villager Jack whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. Max's story soon spread throughout the village and was known to even more people. Those who have heard its story have been deeply moved by its loyalty and love. Its actions make people rethink the relationship between humans and animals, and it also makes people understand that love and companionship are the most important things in life. Although Max's life was short, he interpreted the true meaning of love and loyalty in his own way. Its waiting is not only the nostalgia for the owner, but also the persistence of the most important emotion in life. It teaches us that love is not a momentary passion, but a commitment that transcends time and space. Perhaps, each of us should be like Max and cherish everyone and every relationship around us. Because the most precious thing in life is not what we have, but how much we can give for love. Did Max's story move you? Does its loyalty touch the softest place in your heart? If you are also touched by its story, please give it a thumbs up and let more people know the legend of this dog. In the meantime, don't forget to follow us and subscribe to our channel to share this touching story with your friends and family. Perhaps, this story of love and loyalty can bring warmth and inspiration to more people. Love and loyalty, regardless of race or species. Let's take action together to protect the people and animals we love. Like, subscribe, and retweet, so that Max's story will become a moving force in the hearts of more people.